And for the record, I know the whole truth of that, and that's not true.
I was just being facetious with the term.
Generally, I appreciate the tone of the gentleman from Tennessee, and now I'll recognize the gentleman from Texas for his testimony, his questioning.
Thank you, and I do appreciate the satire in satirically violating the rules of decorum of the House. Yeah, and I always felt it was rather satirical of somebody who had to be lying to say Lying Ted, or the most dishonest person he'd ever met, since he was the most honest man in the race. But let's go back to this Paris Agreement. And I appreciate, Mr. Kontarovich, your written testimony. You got into more detail that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change accepted the Palestinian Authority as a state party. And as you say, the move is part of the Palestinian effort to be declared a state. The United States does not recognize the Palestinian Authority as a state, and U.S. policy has consistently opposed such moves. Therefore, longstanding U.S. law requires the defunding of any UN organization that grants Palestinian Authority such status. We also, I haven't read the Paris Agreement, but my understanding from reading articles about the Paris Agreement, the original Article 9 required developing nations to transfer wealth to underdeveloped nations, and normally that would require congressional action. So, and I know there was this great facade over the Iranian treaty. The Corker bill amended the Constitution with a legislative act by requiring a treaty to only get 1/3 of the vote of the Senate in order to be effectively ratified. I still think the Constitution's intact in that area. It should have required 2/3 to ratify what is a treaty, because it does modify a number of other treaties, like with regard to missiles and proliferation. So on the one hand, I appreciate the testimony. Clearly, if we're going to be transferring American wealth, with all due respect to the President's desire to spread the wealth, that's not something he has authority under the Constitution to do without congressional concurrence. And it also does explain why, after the Kyoto Accords, the underdeveloped nations were all claiming, if we don't get America on board, this agreement doesn't work. What they were saying was, if America doesn't sign on, then the one country that's going to send us checks is not going to be sending us checks, which is the whole reason we're part of this. We want to get checks from the U.S. Congress, from the U.S. Treasury. And so does anybody see a constitutional way of having the United States Treasury send money to the benefit of foreign countries without congressional concurrence in that? Anybody? Mr. Gross?
No, there actually is no way to do that. And
constitutionally? Not
constitutionally.
Yeah, apparently it's going on, like money being provided to Iran without congressional consent. But any other thoughts on that happening?
Well, I mean, the House did and the Senate had an opportunity during the omnibus to put in language strictly, specifically preventing the transfer of the $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund that the President had pledged.
Was there a need to put that in, since that they do not have authority to do that currently?
There was a need to put that in if you wanted to prevent the President from reprogramming other funds from other climate-related international aid areas into the Green Climate Fund, which is what he ultimately did. in order to come up with the $3 billion that he had pledged.
Do you agree that the Senate should have taken a vote on the Iranian agreement as a treaty and determine whether or not they get 2/3 to ratify?
Well, I would defer to Eugene on the Iran nuclear deal issues. We've had debates within our circles about whether the Senate can just decide on its own that an agreement is a treaty and we're going to take a vote on it. There's good arguments on both sides of that issue. I think I agree with you. Whether the Senate can do that, there's good arguments. But I agree with you that the Corker-Cardin bill was, I think, a wrong-headed way to move forward, because you essentially turned a 2/3 advice and consent vote into a 1/3. And
well, my time's expired, but I'm astounded that you think the Senate can call a cow a horse and then it becomes a horse. But thank you for your testimony.
The gentleman from Texas.